I very much appreciate the kind introduction. The interesting thing is that nowadays, who is an expert on fake news? Well, obviously the people who are purveying it, people who are actually broadcasting it. But this is a relatively new area, just as it is also a relatively old area. We have had propaganda forever. We have had propaganda ever since there has been media, as we would think of it, from the time when the Romans had their acta diurna, this sort of daily thing. There's always been propaganda. So what is new? What is different? And from my point of view, as I come to this essentially as an expert in security rather than media studies, I think one of the key things that is new is the relationship between the current geopolitical challenges, which essentially means Russia for now, but in due course will almost certainly mean other challenges, and the changing world. And in a way, this is something that we see across the board in the whole debate about so-called hybrid war. Look, I am an academic, and therefore I am a pedant. And I really don't like this term hybrid war. It doesn't apply, but nonetheless, it is the term we have to use. It's become the term of art. But nonetheless, even if one looks at sort of hybrid war, almost all of the individual tactics are terribly, terribly familiar. It is this relationship of old tactics in a new world which has created something genuinely new, and which we are all still struggling to understand. So what I will be doing is essentially trying to put a broad context on both what is fake news and how does it make a difference, how is it important, how is it dangerous, and then talk about how it actually fits in specifically with Russian policy and the sort of the broad multi-spectrum political war that I would say Mr. Putin's Kremlin is waging against the West. And then finally, some broad issues about what can be done to set the ground for people who know vastly more than I about the specific Latvian situation to actually sort of take this into a much more sort of detailed perspective, and then precisely we'll throw it open for discussion. So let's start with this term, fake news. Well, I mean, here is the problem. Although, again, it's the term, much of what we think of as fake news is not necessarily fake. And often it isn't news either. Why is it not necessarily fake? Well, if we look at the disinformation campaigns that are being waged, I mean, often what they rely on is not outright lies. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a complete invention. I mean, classic example from here is that claim that Canadian soldiers were committing rape and it was being covered up by the authorities and so forth. More often, though, the issue is not outright lies, so much as a willful selectivity of what actually is reported, and a framing, how you put it in particular context. How do you interpret something that has happened? Again, let me give you an example from the country in which I live at the moment, the Czech Republic. We recently had parliamentary elections in which an almost new party, ANO, became the largest party, and its leader, Mr. Babiš, looks set to become the next prime minister. Now, most interpretations of this see this as essentially that the population was unhappy with many of the traditional political parties. There were specific weaknesses with the Social Democrats who had been the previous main party and so forth. All very sober, all very serious. Then you go and see how Russian Первый Канал chooses to interpret that. And this has somehow become a stunning blow against the European Union. Well, Mr. Babiš is a committed, in fact, he's gone on record saying he thinks the Czech Republic would ideally join the euro. It is also somehow a repudiation of NATO for reasons that still befuddle me, given that ANO is still committed to, for example, increasing the Czech defense budget. And more generally, it's seen as a blow against a sort of a Western alliance of political parties. Now, this is in terms of interpretation, politically illiterate. They took a real fact, and what they did is they framed it in ways that many of the readers, or the listeners rather, would have no idea was wrong. There's been a change in government. Okay, how do I explain that? Oh, I am told it's because of this and that. So actually, often it's not fake news, it's fake interpretation that we're dealing with. It's actually how you present things. Or, are you selective? Do you only pick specific examples? If you put together a list of terrorist incidents in the UK, you might think that Britain at the moment had a terrible, terrible challenge and people are dying on the streets all the time. It's not. It's still an extremely safe country. But it's by your selection of information that you shade how people begin to interpret it. So this is what we're talking about, this widely sort of drawn disinformation campaign that draws on genuine lies and things that in some ways are made retrospectively into lies by how they are interpreted for the reader or the listener or the viewer. Now, one of the challenges with dealing with this threat is we're all much too clever. We all know that we wouldn't fall for that. Fake news is something that always affects other people. Those people who aren't as clever as us, those people who aren't as sophisticated as us, those people who don't understand the world quite as well as us. And that's a nice way to think. Unfortunately, that's not true. Now, of course, if you understand much less about the world, if you are exposed to far, far fewer different sources of information, then naturally you have, shall we say, less immunity. And something I'm going to come to is, in some ways, one of the ways of thinking about fake news is as a public health hazard. And I'll explain that in a moment. But anyway, so you have less immunity. But even those of us who are smart and cosmopolitan and clever, we are subject to it. First of all, because increasingly in the modern world, we can choose to exclude alternative perspectives from our knowledge. We follow certain people's Twitter feeds. We follow certain people on Facebook. We choose to go and look at particular websites or read particular newspapers because they fit our own sense of how the world is. And it's easier and easier now for us to selectively decide our own personal news feed and cut out all the alternative perspectives. I mean, again, as someone from the United Kingdom, I was really struck by this with the recent Brexit vote. I make no bones about it. I am definitely a Remainer. And pretty much everyone I know is. And pretty much all the particular news sources that I habitually follow believe that Britain should remain part of the European Union. So, based on my own personal experience, of course, there's no question that we're going to be staying in the European Union. Didn't quite work out that way. And this is because I had excluded all those alternative perspectives, because I found them irritating, or just muddle-headed, or just wrong. So, first of all, actually, we need to realize the extent to which we're all potentially susceptible. And even when we're not selecting ourselves, actually, little bit by bit, things do seep in. I'm sort of, because I'm both a sort of security person and also male. I like tanks and all that kind of thing. Russian television on a Sunday morning, on Zvezda TV, Star TV, which is the Russian military TV channel, have a series of programs, Служу России, I Serve Russia, and Военная приемка, military order, which is all about how amazingly wonderful Russian military technology is. And I watch it because there is a certain fun about it. And because I'm curious, I want to see what they're stressing, and the same way as I watch RT from time to time, and I read Izvestia and all the, and other Russian government sources, because you need to know what message they're saying. And part of me is saying, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I decide what I watch. But inevitably, you can feel some of it sort of steeping in, and you can actually begin to start overestimating Russian military capabilities. And then you actually see them in the field, and sometimes they're still exceedingly capable, and sometimes they are still exceedingly incompetent. But of course, none of that gets onto TV. So we are all susceptible, even on a bit-by-bit basis. Because basically it works in three ways. The whole fake news campaign essentially does all of three things. First of all, it mobilizes. It very rarely will totally change people's perspectives. But what it can do is in some ways radicalize them. I mean, again, if I take the example of Brexit, it's clear that through a media campaign, which is not by any means all or even mainly Russian, I mean, there were many other influences, largely domestic ones, at work. But nonetheless, this is a period of massive propaganda by each side. And it's clear that sort of essentially fake news mobilized by the Leave campaign was very effective in taking a lot of people who felt just a generalized dissatisfaction with the European Union. Just a general sense, and this is a very classic British thing, that everyone on the continent is not quite as good as us, and it's not quite right. But turning that into a sense of, oh my God, Britain's whole identity is in danger. It is not just enough for me to grumble. I actually need to go and vote. So this is the first thing it does. It tends to take existing sort of vague, broad propensities and turn them into a sense that we must act. And interestingly enough, this is actually a strikingly similar trajectory as we've seen with terrorist radicalization. All these beheading videos on YouTube and so forth. I mean, their aim is not to take people and make them change their views, as to take people who are already faintly inclined and think that, no, actually, I must do something, rather than just support it. So that's just a sideline. So, first of all, it mobilizes existing constituencies. Secondly, it does slowly mutate people's views. Bit by bit, and again, this is something that we're only beginning to get decent academic research because it precisely is something that one has to look at over time. But what it does is slowly begin to change the basis of the conversation. It begins to slowly squeeze out the sense that there are alternatives. And so you might say, fake news is not going to suddenly change someone's mind overnight. But what it can do is bit by bit create the preconditions in which they are willing to be mobilized. The sort of examples we've got, particularly, and this is not just in Latvia, but across Europe, there is clearly a very, very assiduous Russian effort to demonize NATO, to make NATO into essentially, into whatever it needs to be in order to appeal to a certain constituency at home. In the Czech Republic, for example, it's very much framed as America's Warsaw Pact. Why? Well, because obviously not only do the Czechs have their own memories of the Warsaw Pact, they also have memories of 1968, when it was Soviet and Warsaw Pact tanks that came in to crush the Prague Spring. So even just that term, Warsaw Pact, is one that has a certain psychological capacity to drive its nails into Czechs' souls. So that depends on the particular importance of the Warsaw Pact. Whereas if you go to Italy, instead of playing up the anti-Americanism or whatever, there the key point is NATO doesn't really care about your security issues. NATO is just about the Russians. And the real issue, of course, is migrants from the south. So in Italy, what they're doing is playing to that particular local sense, which is that, in fact, just NATO is irrelevant. You're just spending money and you're sending planes to the Baltic Air Patrol and whatever, and what does that matter when the real threat from the south is being ignored? So, in a way, what it does is it slowly shifts the terms of the discussions, and we can begin to see, over time, certain phrases, memes, concepts from fake news beginning to make their way into wider political debate. But that's a slower process. But of course, often that's not going to have any impact. The third key impact of fake news is to mystify. If you cannot convince people that your truth is the truth, the next best thing is to convince people that there is no truth. And we have seen this particularly striking with the MH17, the Dutch MH17 airliner that was shot, Malaysian airliner that was shot down on its way from the Netherlands over the Donbass. I mean, it is clear, we do know. We know who shot him down. We know what they used. Particularly since then, citizen journalists have actually tracked the progression of this Buk missile system across the Russian border and then back when they hurriedly realize what they've done. I mean, the people that we even have still recordings of militia, Russian proxy forces crowing that they'd shot down a plane, which are then hurriedly suppressed when they realized what the plane was. So actually, on one level, look, we know this. But the Russians unleashed from the very beginning this massive barrage of alternative perspectives, most of which were ridiculous. That this was a plane that had already been loaded up full of dead bodies anyway as part of a provocation. That a Ukrainian jet, which incidentally couldn't even reach the necessary altitude, somehow shot it down. All these umpteen different conspiracy theories and so forth. Not because they expect or want you to believe any of them, but because they want to create an environment where you think, I suppose we'll never know the truth. Because that is good. I said, the thing about fake news, the thing about disinformation is as often as not, it is not about changing how you think in an active way. It is about stopping you being able to sort of have any certainty about acting and thinking in any other way. Most of these sort of low-level campaigns are not dictated from the Kremlin or anything like that. They are individual journalists, individual news outlets thinking, I know something I can do with this story and it might please the Kremlin. MH17 was a difference. I spoke to someone whom I met who actually worked in the RT Russian propaganda TV station. And I was talking to him trying to understand how it works. And he said one thing, MH17 was different because absolutely, as soon as it had happened, and as soon as Moscow realized what had happened and that this was not something they could suppress, that's when absolutely the order went out to all the various media channels. This is the line. You come up with anything you can think of, just to basically obscure the reality in a cloud of myth, claim, and rumor. So, if you're already disgruntled, it wants to motivate you into doing something about it. If you're open to discussion, it wants to slowly move that basis of discussion into a more comfortable area for it. And if all else fails, if they can't convince you, they want you just simply to think that it's impossible to know the truth. These all have political impact. And what I want to do next is precisely connect this much more specifically into how the Russians are using it. Depending on which audience I'm talking to and in which country, sometimes I'm sort of described as a hawk for saying this, and sometimes a dove. I do not think that Russia has military ambitions within NATO countries. However, I also think that as far as Russia is concerned, it is at war with the West. And I say that on the basis of actually having been told that by many Russians, precisely within the national security establishment, within the military, within the sort of political class, within the foreign ministry. Many Russians genuinely believe themselves to be at war with the West. Now, there's not time to go into it. In many cases, it's because they think that we somehow are doing them an injustice. In my opinion, they're wrong. But anyway, that doesn't matter. Why does not matter. The what matters. Putin's Russia is currently on a war footing. Putin's Russia is currently thinking that we are stopping Russia from attaining its true goals. Which is what? Putin, essentially, I think, having come into power as a nationalist, but essentially a pragmatic figure, I think is increasingly now consumed by thoughts of his own place in history. Like almost all authoritarian leaders, he has become something of a caricature of himself. And especially since his return to the presidency in 2012, his campaign to make Russia great again, to resume Russia's status as a great power, I think has become absolutely central to Russian policy. But what does that mean? Now again, this is one of the interesting things. In the modern world, what is a great power? A great power is one that is economically dynamic. A great power is one that has strong soft power, so other people think of it as an example to follow. A great power is one that is interconnected in all the important global conversations because people want it to be there. not really Putin's concept of a great power. Putin is essentially a 19th century geopolitician. A great power has what? It has an empire. It has a sphere of influence, first of all. So as far as he's concerned, countries such as Georgia, some countries such as Ukraine and so forth, should realize that they are part of Russia's sphere of influence. They're not proper countries, they're satellites. Secondly, no one tells a great power what to do. International law, international courts, these should have no traction on Russia because that's what a great power is. And thirdly, a great power should have a voice in every global conversation, and a voice means a veto. Doesn't matter what's happening in the world, somehow Russia should be there. And it's understandable on one level quite why Putin thinks that. Putin is a product of the old Soviet era. Much is made of his KGB background. He was a pretty indifferent KGB officer. Let's be honest, he was not a superstar. He was not James Bond. But on the other hand, what it says about someone who actively, when he's still at school, went to the KGB and said, "Excuse me, how do I join?" And even the KGB were thinking, okay, it's a bit weird. Go away, Sonny, go and do your degree and then maybe we'll talk. He's very much a product of many of the instincts of the old Soviet order, if not necessarily the ideology. But he's also, I would say, very much a product of the end of empire. This sense that Russia has suddenly gone from being one of the great global superpowers to a second-rank regional power. A country with an economy the size of Spain's. Now, I have nothing against Spain, but we don't often find ourselves thinking, well, no global issue can be sorted out without Spain being involved or whatever. So basically, Putin has aspirations that are wildly out of key with Russia's current place in the objective place in the world. So what he has done, like any good guerrilla, is to move the battlefield to where he thinks we are weakest. And where does he think we are weakest? He believes our greatest weakness is precisely that we are a constellation of democracies. Now, I'm all in favor of that. But it's certainly true. There is a constellation of democracies. We have open and legitimate disagreements within our countries and between our countries. We have all kind of, sort of constraints of the rule of law. We have a belief that multiple perspectives are right, and it's okay for people to have different views, in a way that, trust me, you don't go on to Russian television if you want to present an anti-Kremlin perspective. So what he's trying to do is exactly to exploit those opportunities. And in many ways, Putin was tremendously lucky. He came to power just at a time when oil and gas prices boomed, providing him with all kinds of money so that he could buy off the ordinary Russian citizen, spend money on the military, allow the oligarchs and his friends to steal at a ridiculous rate. And there was money for all that. Well, that money isn't there anymore, but his more recent bit of luck is that precisely this is a time in which, anyway, the West is facing a certain degree of a crisis of legitimacy. We would anyway, even if Putin had never been born. There would still be discussions about the future of the European Union and what shape it would take. There would still be tensions in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, these things would be there anyway. And what Putin is trying to do is to exploit it. What he wants to do, does he want to take us over? Does he want to conquer us? No. He wants to neutralize us. That is his primary goal. He's aware that Russia is stronger than many European countries on a one-to-one basis, but what makes us stronger, whether in NATO or the European Union, is precisely our unity. It's our unity that allows us to actually sort of defend our values, defend our own security, defend our own position in the world and our vision for how the world should evolve. So he needs to break that. And so, I'd say that he's involved in this sort of full spectrum political war, which involves the use of a whole variety of different actors, of which fake news is just one part. It's also a massive intelligence campaign. Russian espionage is up to the same peak as at the height of the Cold War. It's also in the use of corruption, attempts at using economic penetration to have political impact. It's intent to suborn regional elites and so forth. There's a whole variety of things that he's doing which interconnect and are all sort of part of a complementary struggle. Obviously, I'm going to focus on the fake news dimension, but I think it's worth mentioning that everything from a Russian company to a Russian-based organized crime grouping could, in theory, not every time, but could be used as an instrument for this political war against the West. Because he wants to divide us, first and foremost. He also wants to distract us. He wants us to be so concerned with other issues that we're not really paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine or elsewhere. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Russians were very keen on Brexit, because they knew that sort of the amount of crisis that this would create within the whole concept of the European Union. And thirdly, he wants to demoralize us. And this is an important point. We have to talk seriously about what the Russians are doing. We have to be open and candid about the challenge that they pose. But we have to do that in context. If we go all the way the other way, I mean, and some of the coverage you find it sort of almost implies that Putin gets to decide election results, and that Putin has this massive, all-powerful media machine that can do anything. We make Putin much more powerful than he really is. I mean, just as a sideline, there's a part of me that almost feels our best approach to Putin would be to laugh at or ignore him. I mean, that's what really gets to him, that sense that he's not being treated as a great global figure. But that's a sort of a sideline. So we need to understand this threat in context. We need to understand what it can do, but also what it can't. We must not get excessively hung up on the scale of Russia's threat. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about Russian military capabilities, Russian intelligence capabilities, Russian fake news capacities. We have to calibrate how we understand them to as near as possible an accurate level, or else there are always going to be some people who think, oh my God, Putin's too dangerous, we must make a deal with him. What would he like? He would love some kind of rerun of the Yalta talks that took place at the end of World War II, in which Stalin, Churchill, and FDR divided up the world. This is yours. Everything on this side is yours. Everything on this side is ours. Putin would love that. If he could have a line drawn that says Ukraine is his, I'm sure he'd probably let us have Bashar Assad if we really want, or whatever, because that doesn't really matter to him. But if we do that, apart from the fact that then we are betraying the aspirations and the hopes of the Ukrainians and the Georgians and all these other people, and in the process also shattering the notion of the post-1945 global order, which is based on the idea that every country has its own sovereignty. Every country, no matter how small or how large, has its chance to make its own way. We're just simply saying, unless it's inconvenient. So not only would we not do that for that reason, but the point is there are going to be some who will be tempted to do that. We see this, for example, every time there is serious discussion within Finland and Sweden about potentially joining NATO. That's the point when all of a sudden you have Russian nuclear bombers sort of on patrol close to or inside their airspace. That's the point when we have Russian military exercises that are wargaming an invasion. That's the point when you sometimes have very open threats that basically you join NATO and you're going to find nuclear crosshairs over your country. Because there's going to be some people who are scared of that. Some people who take it seriously and therefore think, oh my God, no, that's too dangerous, we need to back away. So this is where it fits in. It's actually, it's Russia trying to divide us, trying to distract us and trying to demoralize us so that ultimately we are neutralized. We can't stop Putin doing the things that he wants to do. However, as I said, this is not solely a Russia problem. At the moment, it is absolutely a Russia problem. But this is also a modernity problem. This is about how nowadays media has become, the whole concept of media is changing. What is the media anymore? Is my Twitter feed the media? Yes? No? Probably yes. The thing is actually the old days in which we basically received our news either through rumour and gossip or else through a relative handful of established channels that were controlled and had gatekeepers. You know, they had editors and owners, and you know, we knew there was BBC, there was ITV in Britain, the commercial and the state channels, and then there were a few more commercial channels, but still nothing like nowadays when you can plug in your satellite TV and see everything from Chinese news to Al Jazeera to RT to CNN to Fox, if you really must. But meanwhile, it's not even just about TV and newspapers anymore. It's exactly the fact that we increasingly look to other sources. You know, I mean, Twitter. I'm actually quite an assiduous Twitter user, but nonetheless, I look at the extent to which, under the Trump presidency, in some ways, Twitter has become the White House press department. And therefore, okay, who controls that? Well, the answer is, well, sometimes apparently not even Donald Trump, it seems. Sometimes it's his lawyer. But the point is, nowadays there are so many different things. We can go online and something can look like a good news source because it's just someone who happens to know a bit of coding is running a blog off his laptop in his bedroom. And some of that is really good. I mean, look, as someone who studies Russia, Russian TV is, as I said, on the whole, at best, useful for a laugh, at most. But the thing is, there is still so much amazingly good news, well-done news coverage coming out of Russia. And some of it is in the remaining print newspapers, some of it is in the online newspapers, but a lot of it is actually also precisely from citizen journalists who are reporting about this is what's happening in my town, or this is what's happening, you know, on my particular issue. You know, if you want to know about Russian organized crime, you read Prime Crime. You know, there is so much is on there, and in this respect, actually, it's a good thing. New media allows us to bypass states that seek to dominate and control news streams. And even in China, where, you know, obviously they are particularly, you know, assiduous in trying to control everything that is online, but every new control they bring in, people will find new ways around it. New ways of encoding, or just simply sort of making the censorship systems not pick up on what they're being said. In the process, we are obviously being bombarded with news sites and things, and we have no idea how to control them, how to use them, how to understand them. And at the moment, who is using them most effectively? There are three actors that are dominant in this scene. One is the Russians, one is Islamic State, and one are all those companies that want to sell you things. We sometimes forget about that. You know, all those companies that want to tell you why their car is best, why their microwave oven is the most handsome, why their particular brand of soap powder cleans your clothes all the best. Is this fake news? Well, yes and no. I wouldn't push that too far because otherwise the term begins to become a bit meaningless. Every dating site becomes a fake news site. But the point is, it speaks to the extent to which we have to realize that nowadays there is no way we can control what is out there. And we have sort of Twitter and Facebook and so forth saying, oh no, we're sorry, we realize we need to do more. And there is a certain amount that can and will be done with the use of algorithms, particularly ones, there's some fascinating new technologies which will not just identify what is, for example, comments that are posted by trolls, you know, people who are just sort of paid online commentators, but even which specific troll, based on everything from IP address, which is sort of the kind of computer address, through to just simply how they write, and even what speed they type at, all these kind of things. That's fine. But this technology is not going to fix it unless we're willing to go in the direction of total online censorship, which I don't think we are. So let's just appreciate that when we talk about dealing with this current challenge, we have to think of it also as a long-term issue. This is a challenge that will outlive Vladimir Putin. This is a challenge which will outlive his particular imperial experiment and adventure. So, to conclude, What can we do? Well, we're going to hear some sort of specific advice here. But anyway, I want to put it at 3 levels, which is going to, if we're talking about an information war, well, in war one thinks of the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. Sort of from how you win this battle to how you sort of prepare your campaign to actually how you win the war as a whole. Now, on a tactical level, there are lots of specific things that can be done. There is myth-busting, challenging particular online falsehoods. I'm not the greatest of fan of that, because there's just no way you can possibly keep up. It's like trying to deal with a rainstorm by batting each individual raindrop out of the way. But certainly there are some specific lies that can and should be precisely rebutted. So that's important. One can obviously apply one's media laws much more carefully. We have to think about, well, most media laws were drawn up not to consider things like all this online thing. We need to think about a whole new body of that and then actually apply it properly. More broadly, on sort of operational level, I mean, we have to think about how we actually understand the threat, and this is why events like this are so important. Not just in terms of a sort of a general educational experience, but because what they say about a national conversation that is taking place about what is and is not the real nature of the challenge and what can be done about it. And I think this is absolutely crucial. This is not a problem that can and should be dealt with from above by government alone. Obviously, government has a key role. But when it comes down to it, and this is sort of the most important kind of strategic issue, it is about a public decision. What kind of world do we want? Do we want a world in which actually anyone can peddle any kind of dangerous and destructive lie? And because it's entertaining, or it's sexy, or it's on a really nicely done web page, we might be more likely to believe it. What do we want to do about it? We need to educate the public so that people are much, much more aware of when they are being lied to. By anyone. By politicians, I'm sure that never happens in Latvia. By advertisers, but also by hostile foreign powers and so forth. That's a basic skill that really needs to be applied. Second sort of key strategic point is legitimacy. One of the reasons why people turn to alternative media is because they don't trust the regular media. And in part, that's a failure of the regular media. We need to address how both political systems and the media can regain some of the legitimacy that they have lost. And a final point that is very specific to the Russian threat. It's all very well talking about grand long-term strategies, but look, if this is an information war, and that is the term, and that is how the Russians think of it, well, wars have to be fought. Now, one of the approaches, which I've sometimes seen advocated, is basically we should fight back on the same terms. We should bombard Russia with lies of our own. I am flatly opposed to that. We will not defeat Putin by Putinizing ourselves. However, that does not mean that there's nothing we can do. We need to make sure that our counterintelligence services are well resourced, and the situation in Latvia in that respect is actually quite encouraging. But there are many NATO countries which that could not be said, so that they can at least identify when, for example, Russian money is sifting in to support particular news outlets or influence particular journalists and so forth. But more generally, people. For example, Россия сегодня, sort of the main state media holding, people like Dmitry Kiselyov, who's their kind of both director but also sort of cheerleader for propaganda-in-chief. They like to think of themselves as precisely the warriors of the information war. Well, okay. But in that case, I think we should be much, much more specific in terms of targeting people who are involved in the fake news campaign against the West for personal sanctions. We're not going to go and assassinate them, but at least we can stop them from having nice apartments in the West and keeping their money in Western bank accounts because they don't trust their own Russian banks. At least we can stop them from sending their kids to our universities, even while grooming them to be the next generation of propagandists at home. I think, again, we need to, this is a question of balance. Without going overboard, without going too far, we need to appreciate that we are, like it or not, in a political war. And as such, we need to do everything we can to protect ourselves, but we also need to make sure that there are costs for those people who are waging their war against us. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you very much indeed.